Now, all I can remember about why I decided to put this particular battle on this day was that whilst it didn't take place in April, it didn't have anything really to do with April, it just felt like it should take place at this part of the year. This is the Battle of Zonchio, 1499, which actually took place in August. And normally I try and do battles in the months that they happen. But this battle is special. It's the first battle where cannon are used by both sides in a naval war or a naval battle, and honestly, it's also a battle where, how do I put this politely, leadership proves decisive still in this particular war. The quality of leadership you have is going to define your victory. It's an Ottoman-Venetian war, of course, and there is Castile and Aragon as part of it, but mainly they inherit the gripe of the Venetians against the Ottomans, and it's an understandable gripe. It is an understandable gripe. This particular war was fought 20 years after the first Ottoman-Venetian war, and how do I put this politely? To be honest, there is an argument it was fought literally because they just hadn't had a war in a long time, and the gripes had built up. You see, the thing about the Ottoman Empire and the Venetian Empire is they are both trading empires. They are both trading empires. I know, this can seem very strange, and when we're getting into the discussions of the Ottoman Empire, people will think, what do you mean, a trading empire? Basically, both empires fundamentally make their money over being able to move goods from one place to another. And you can make more money the more of the proportion of the distance you can control. You can charge more tax on merchants. You can enjoy far more security and far better privileges the more of the area you control of the movement of the goods. Now, Venice had formed itself to control pretty much the movement of the goods by sea from the Levant. That's sort of lower Turkey, lower modern Turkey, Lebanon, Israel, Egypt, sort of that sort of area of the world, to Europe. Now, you might feel I'm being a bit vague about my description of the area. Well, that's because, like a lot of things when we're talking about geography in this period, you can look up and find about 5 different definitions for it, and honestly, constructively, it doesn't really matter. Because basically it means the merchants were going to that area, picking up the things which are coming on the spice trade and possibly along the Silk Road, etc., and were taking it to Europe. They were taking it back to Venice, and from Venice it would go up into northern Europe, through the Alps, etc. That is what we're talking about. That was the trade they were doing. And add to that, there was banking and other activities the Venetians were getting involved in. It was wonderful. The Ottomans are the same. The Ottomans control the overland routes. The Ottomans want to control not only the Red Sea route, which is what leads to their constant wars with Persia, and they want to control the Mediterranean route as well, because the more of the routes you control, the better. The more of the trade you control. And the trouble is, both sides are pushing at each other. The Ottomans have the mass. The Venetians have, honestly, a very flexible ability when it comes to diplomacy. The ability to suck in a lot of punishment as long as they're still making money. And, more importantly, a desire to build up technology and to actually organize themselves. The Venetians are the closest to trying to run themselves like the Roman Republic, with the idea that people could be both traders, government officials and naval officials or military officials at the same time sometimes, that those things were not mutually exclusive. And in fact, it was better sometimes if they were all those things. It didn't always work out well. Sometimes it ended up with having good leaders, sometimes it ended up with them having bad leaders. Sometimes it ended up with them having leaders who were more obsessed with making their own personal money than with actually leading Venice. And sometimes it meant you had leaders who were actually pretty darn terrible at making their own money, but actually turned out to be very good at leading the country. And when I say pretty darn terrible, they just kept failing upwards. It was, yeah. Venice is a very interesting scenario, and I have a good lecturer, a guy called Glyn, Professor Glyn Stewart, who, Professor Glyn Richardson. Sorry, I called him Glyn Stewart. I have too many Glyns in my life. I have a science fiction author called Glyn Stewart, who is a wonderful friend. And I have Glyn Richardson, who was my supervisor when I was doing my bachelor's and many, many other things. A wonderful, wonderful Renaissance historian. And every time you asked him to describe the Republic of Venice and its politics, he would sit there and go, there is a reason they ended up in war so often, and why people who studied Venice believed war was the continuation of politics by another means. Because it was. This is Venice at various points at the height of its powers. Now, one of the interesting things about the Ottoman-Venetian War of 1499 to 1503 is that the Ottomans probably win the war, because they take Modane, Durazzo, and Coron. But Venice does take Cephalonia and Ithaca. As you can see, Durazzo is quite clearly pictured on that map. Durazzo matters. All these places mattered. They are entrepôts, they are trading places. They're also quite important because if you're using galleys, and remember, galley trading was the norm at this point, you need places you can pull in and rest your oarsmen. And often that's not aboard ship. Often that's going to be on land. And so you want places you can pull into. It also helps because they give you places where you can protect your trade from. You can secure your trade, because for Venice, well, securing the Adriatic matters. Otherwise, Venice doesn't have access to the sea. It had been quite an expansive empire for their size. It's a maritime city-state, and it has a maritime empire. But the trouble is, it got caught between a load of massive land powers, and it didn't have anywhere near the resources it needed to fight those. We often forget the advantage Britain has as a maritime power is that it's an island nation, like Japan. But it has more resources, unlike Japan, and less earthquakes, unlike Japan. And sometimes the theories which come out for how maritime nations should defend and project their power don't really apply to nations which are not Britain or Japan. For Venice, they could project this power and do this as long as they could politically divide the nations around them. As long as they were city-states, as long as they were small powers all fighting each other, Venice was the big. Venice was able to be the boss because they had the money and the trade. And they were able to buy you. The moment they find themselves dealing with a massive power, they're in trouble. Because they have to invest in their navy to control their maritime trade. But if they invest in their navy, they're not going to be able to invest enough in their army, and that puts them at a disadvantage when it comes to fighting land battles. But invest in their army, then their maritime trade is going to destroy and they'll have no money. It's a catch-22 dilemma. And they're fighting against the Ottomans. Now, the Ottomans, this is the example I give. This is what they look like in 1481. By 1499, they've grown a little bit bigger. The thing is, and the important thing is, the Ottoman Empire are expanding and taking over trade. If they can expand south, they can control the Levantine ports. If they can expand west, they can control the ports the trade is going to. The big markets for selling these goods are not Italy. Italy makes the money from selling these goods, but they're not the big market for these goods. That's one of the key points to think about. Are you selling the goods to Italy, or are you selling the goods in Italy to other traders who are going to take them elsewhere? That's what is happening in Italy. Italy has been the centre for commercial traffic and trade in this point in the Mediterranean since Roman times. There's a lot of infrastructure still in place. It's been far easier to maintain it and keep it going than to replace it, and there's no one been powerful enough to replace it since the Roman Empire. So Italy is still the entrepot. Italy is still the hub at which the financial resources are shifting around Europe. Now, this is beginning to change in this period, which is another problem for the Venetians. Those pesky Northern Europeans are fed up with paying the taxes and watching the Italian merchants get rich while they're paying through the nose for things. It's just terrible. And, by the way, we now have ships which can sail all the way around there. But the thing is, it's still the case at this point. And the Ottoman Empire is after that. I know people like to talk about things in terms of religion and the glory and the power and all these things, and honor and all these things, but no, it's money. Fundamentally, it's money. And for empires, you expand or you die. You expand or you die. Because you always need new lands to provide more resources to feed your armies, new lands to reward your friends, new land. Well, usually you end up with new lands because your border is against another empire, and it turns into a struggle because if they don't expand, they die. If you don't expand, you die. So you end up expanding against each other and fighting, and it's just a constant fun. Now, there are other ways to expand your empire. There are. You don't just have to expand it through land. You can invest in the territories. You can invest in infrastructure. You can invest in agriculture, in mining, and in growing things. And all these are viable options to grow your empire without growing it physically. There are many examples of empires through history which did change to that methodology. Not necessarily mutually beneficial for the places which they were colonizing, or which were part of their empire, but they were certainly putting in infrastructure, etc., which assisted them in getting the money, getting increased financial value out of that empire. These things don't, investing in infrastructure doesn't have to be altruistic. It really doesn't. But at this point, the Byzantines had gone, and whilst the Ottomans had taken over the Byzantine Empire, the thing is about taking over the Byzantine Empire is you're taking over the relics of Rome, and to an extent you can afford to city build. You've got infrastructure there, and you just have to maintain it. And I want to clarify what I'm about to say. The Ottoman people, this does not apply to, okay? The Ottoman people do innovate, they're doing all sorts of things, there's all sorts of interesting ideas and technologies which comes out of the Ottoman Empire and its people. The Ottoman state, however, gets very bad at infrastructure investment and understanding the long-term things of these. In fact, infrastructure investment becomes factional. And that is a very bad thing long-term for an empire. For different factions to be in favour of different pieces of infrastructure, and for therefore to be basically peaks and troughs in infrastructure funding. You don't want that. By the way, that's one of the things that amazes me is the Ottoman Empire gets like that, and they manage to last as long as they do. which shows their other good qualities in terms of their managing their capabilities. But usually when empires get like that, it basically means it's the end. The moment our empires, or nation states even, start thinking investing in infrastructure and those sort of things is a factional thing of, you either do, if you do it, you're one party, if you don't do it, you're another party. Or dividing off infrastructure, one will invest in one type of infrastructure, one will invest in the other type of infrastructure, and they won't invest in the thing that the other supports. That's usually the beginning of the end. That's usually the beginning of the end, because infrastructure is the one thing which is usually beneficial to all involved for the nation. Whether you like it or not, as a means, investing it is usually better than not. Now, one of the reasons why they could start to take this on board, and this approach on infrastructure on board, is because the Ottomans quite quickly start to develop naval power and naval capability and investment in navies. Why? Because despite being a land power, especially as the empire expands around the Mediterranean, and especially as it expands beyond into other parts of the world, despite being a land power, the internal lines of communication are maritime, are naval. And especially when you were trying to besiege Constantinople, which of course had previously been Byzantium and is today Istanbul, especially when you're trying to besiege it, you needed a naval strength. And so the Ottomans had built up a naval strength. And they had fought others before. Now, before we go too much into detail, I think especially before I get to the Shameless book plug, I have to point out that this battle is otherwise known as the First Battle of Lepanto, and it's also known as the Battle of Sebzia. I tend to go to Battle of Zonchio, because it differentiates it from the other Lepanto battles, and it makes it easier to remember. But honestly, it's when you realise that the point we're talking about where they're fighting is a well-worn maritime trade route, and it's... how do I put this? Kind of like the battles of Bull Run between Richmond and Washington, D.C. in the American Civil War. It's basically the two sides setting out, sailing from their respective bases where they're likely to come into contact. And it's what happens. Constantly. We'll talk about this particular passage of water later day. For now, it's Shameless book plug. So it's a Shameless book plug. What do I do in a Shameless book plug? Well, I say thank you for watching. I hope you like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And by the way, there's a bell down there on the subscribe button. If it is an empty bell, then you will get YouTube's personalized view of what they think you will like. So YouTube will decide what you watch and when you watch it by what they advertise to you in your feed. If it is a filled-in bell, a full bell, then you will always hear what I am saying and what I am putting out. By the way, that works for everyone else as well. Just thought I'd add it in. It's the argument of, why do you not get notified sometimes about videos going live? Well, YouTube has decided that it doesn't think you would like it, so it hasn't notified you. But thank you, because seriously, this channel would not be possible without your support, without your liking, your sharing, your subscribing, without you supporting the channel, putting, being members, super chats, all the wonderful people who are patrons suggesting topics. It wouldn't be there. I wouldn't be able to buy the books and all the other extra research I do for this channel, and I wouldn't be able to spend the time I do spending it doing the teaching of it. I love it. It's a fun thing to be doing. Whether it's sensible for my future, life, and what I'll do is I'll tell you in 20 years. But currently, I really enjoy it, and it's all thanks to you that it's possible. So thank you. Now, before we get into talking about the fleets, you have to have something explained for the people who don't know much about the fleets of the period. And the fleets of any period, honestly. Names are a variable feast, okay? I've got Caravel-built carracks as my definition of 4 ships there. I will normally refer to them as probably carracks, because that is closer to what they are in design and in probable form, to these ships here, than they are to caravels, which are slightly smaller. There are sources which describe various vessels in this battle as galeases. Unfortunately, galeases are galleys which are built for war, is the definition, and yes, that basically means heavy galleys. However, the definition ship we often use for a galease is usually something which we would expect to see 1540s, 1550s. Basically, they are developed from the large mercantile galley and reinforced. They were tall and wide, rather light, and mounted a very big number of cannon. But again, they are more something we associate and inform if we're looking at the pictures of them and the ships we see. If we look at the pictures and things we can see of them, you are getting an impression of what we're talking about 40-odd years later. So I prefer to use heavy galley, because that is more accurate for that time period. It's also more encompassing, because whilst some are certainly getting onto the size of being a small galease or galeaser and are pushing the direction, others are not quite there yet, and so calling them heavy galleys gives you a more accurate description of them. Then we have the light galleys, or the galliots, depending on your perspective. Example of them could be this vessel here. It's got a single gun forward, and it's a good little ship. And then we got the Fustas and the Grippi, and honestly, just think small vessel, okay? Just think small. Just think small. That just makes your life a lot easier than trying to get into the exacts on them, because they are such wide definitions that there is such a range that you will just end up going, ah! Or you'll end up doing a, what was that? Not the recent series of Picard. The second season of Picard, where they basically copied and pasted a single ship design to provide an entire fleet. Yeah, you'll end up doing that mentally, and that's still not correct. And then we have the Ottoman fleet, who are also described sometimes as having galeases, but they definitely don't have them. They had roughly 3 heavy galleys, 60 regular galleys, 30 light galleys, which are probably close to galleot in style, 40 fustas, which again are small sailing vessels, broadly speaking, with some oars, and then palanderes, Jersey, and cargo ships. Now, palanderes, there could be many as 111 of those in the operations. It's just these fleets are full of different ships. But broadly speaking, what are we dealing with? Broadly speaking, what are we looking at? Well, they're all armed with cannon. And when I say all armed with guns, I'm talking about larger vessels. I'm fairly sure the Fustas, Grappini, and the really small vessels, if they do have anything, they are very, very lucky and probably have a very rich captain in charge. That's about it. But the combiners on both sides are going to have cannon, and this is the first battle where these ships will be fighting heavily with cannon. Now, the thing is, the advantage of having Caravel-built carracks and other ships like that in a fleet is they give you the high ground. They allow you to fire down. That's their advantage over these galleys. The advantage of galleys is that when the wind dies down, they can still move. They can still move. This comes from a graving on the Battle of Messina Straits. It's definitely nothing to do with what we're discussing today, but it's the best picture I can find that gives you an example of it. Of how the galleys and how the larger ships would fight, how the galleys would group together in pairs. Often in pairs. And cooperate with each other. And you can see this in the case that a single caravel is being surrounded by 6 such galleys. But the caravel has such a firepower advantage in terms of being able to fire down and volume of cannon that it's not an unequal fight. It will probably lose, but it won't necessarily lose. And pretty much your argument could be that, broadly speaking, the Ottoman fleet is larger, more flexible for that, and has brought more together, but is larger. And the Venetian fleet is heavier. It's more heavily armed. It's more heavily built. It is built more for a fight. One, you could argue, is the fleet of a maritime power who is resource rich in terms of their access to resources, but human resources poor. And the other is a power who is human resources very rich, infrastructure developing, on this regard anyway, but who also has a problem that they have a huge land force they have to sustain, and they have to sustain both. They can't afford not to sustain both because of their situation. So yeah, the ships involved. It's quite an interesting grouping. Again, people try and do very hard and fast analysis and numbers of fleets in this period, and one of the problems you have is that some of those ships are going to be supply ships for the formation, moving supplies backwards and forwards. They're going to be on detached duties. They're going to be wandering around, especially when you're dealing with larger numbers and the vagrancies of wind as well. It's just easier to say approximately, because anyone can find sources from any day which are going to differentiate. And one of the interesting things is the number of English sources, which will tell you that the Venetians had roughly 15 caravels at the fight. And then the Italian sources, specifically the Diary of Venice, will tell you they had 4 caravels at the fight. And you sort of look at it and look it up and you go, well, actually, they seem to have more, but some seem to be in a supporting logistical role. And the caravels they're describing are basically carracks. So if you're let's say, I don't want to say Western observer, but because that sounds weird, but if you're a Western European observer, and especially a Northern European observer, you are going to see those ships and go, they are carracks. If you're a Venetian time, you might well call them a caravel, because it's evolved as far as you're concerned, and they're the same thing. They're just the big caravels. Life is fun. Life is fun. The problems really begin with the Venetian command structure, because you have a man called Antonio Grimaldi, who is going to go and become a doge, who is mercantilely very experienced. In terms of mercantile trade, very experienced. In terms of actual service, in terms of naval experience, well, he's been superintendent of the arsenal. He's been a senior member of the council. He's been an advisor to the Doge. His son, Domenico, is a cardinal. He has a tremendous political network. And so he's elected captain of the sea. And the phrase is he was forced to accept and lead the fleet against the enemy. Honestly, he probably was looking at it as a shining light to make himself doge. Let's be honest. If he won the battle, he would have ticked off every single box. He would have been the new Caesar in all but name, and he probably would have been able to go for Doge. At the moment the current Doge died, he would have been able to go for it. The trouble is, if you are made a Captain General of the Sea, and you have to deal with captains of the sea, and the captains of the sea, if they know their business, will be arguing with you constantly and putting forward their own ideas and their own plans. And that's a problem, because you have to decide between those plans. And if you have no experience to draw from that is relevant, it is very difficult for you to set them a shibboleth, to work out whether what they're saying is true and accurate or self-serving. It is very difficult. And so whilst I can list off the various commanders that they have there, apart from Gramani, they have Niccolo Pesaro, Simon Goro, Domenico Melipro, Niccolo Marcello, Alvise Marcello, Andrea Lodin, Francisco Zigona, and Rugo Bardua. And we can talk about their capabilities. They are open to debate. They are open to discussion. I'd also say there is a strong debate as to how many carracks they have there. Most of the English language sources I read do say they had 15. And so I've gone with that. But at least a couple of the Italian sources I've read have said they had less carracks, or rather they had caravels rather than carracks there. Well, which probably were caravel-built carracks anyway. And they seem to, some of the Italian sources seem to draw far greater distinction between the types of ships and give them their very specialist names rather than the generic name. So I think that might be the differential, but I want to be quite sure I mentioned that because we're moving beyond the ships and it seemed worthwhile. The thing is, as Captain General say, you have to make decisions. And if you've watched my videos, especially around, I don't know, Cartagena de Indias, etc., and the battles there, they start to have war councils where they met in Modone, where they were dealing with the fact that galley captains and the senior officers were advising Romani to take the fleet out to sea so it won't be bottled up in the port. Grimani, being a politician who don't like to make decisions, it's a genetic thing, I think, sometimes, didn't want to take a final decision, and so decided he was going to think about it. That happened on the 10th of July, they had that war council. On the 23rd of July, the Ottoman fleet reached Malvisa. 24th July, they're at Cape Matapan. The Venetians decide the Turks are going to want to attack the Ottomans. Turks. They alternate in their sources between what they call them. Would be wanting to attack Lepanto. And actually, still on 24th of July, the Ottomans entered the Gulf of Coron and reached Cape Gallo to land some troops on Spezia. Sapienza. So, what do the Venetians do? They have another war council. Remember, they had one of those on the 10th of July. They have another one on the 24th, 25th of July. And finally, on the 20th of July, the Venetian fleet moves windward, off 10 miles off the coast to 6 miles from the Turkish fleet. But the thing is, Grimani's looking at the size of the Ottoman fleet. He's looking at the size. He's looking at the fact they are carrying huge amounts of firepower with them. And is basically going, do I want to do this fight? Like here? Does this look sensible? Because if I lose a battle, it's going to be worse for my political career. If I lose a battle, it's going to be worse for my political career. And so what he does is he splits up his force. He sends the large galleys and large ships to sail out to sea and return to Modone with the light galleys. And he just keeps doing that over the next few days, forming up, watching the Ottomans, and then withdrawing. This reaches the end of July, and the Ottomans are starting to get a bit sort of nonplussed by their presence. And finally reach August. And in August, the Ottomans start to move towards Navarino. And this forced the Venetians to start thinking about actual solid battle. But if you think about that, they've had war counts on 10th of July, where they were told they should probably go out and fight. And it's got into August, and so far they've done nothing but posture. That wears down your morale, and that increases the enemy morale, which is not good. It's really not good. And then we have Camalres. Now, this is an interesting soul. This really is. He's a very good sailor. And I got this picture from, I have to admit, the Turkish Wikipedia. Because trying to find a picture for Camalres has proved nigh on impossible, for reasons I understand. But while I was doing it, I did come across the Turkish Wikipedia page for Camalres. And I found a picture of his flagship, the Gok, and I went, if I can't find anything else, I'm using that because that looks cool. So can we please all agree this looks cool? I'm not sure where it comes from. I have very little details, but it looks cool as anything. And frankly, it's cool. It's just cool. With that being said, he is a skilled naval officer. And a skilled officer generally. He was a very famous Ottoman sailor by the end of the 15th century. He'd sailed the coast of Spain, Africa, the Straits Steppe, the Balearic Islands. He'd fought Christian pirates. Knights Hospitaller. You know, mainly. I had to do it that way, otherwise I would probably have been taken out by a certain gentleman called Garrus the Brit, who's in the shipshape crew. Good team. It's a good team. He'd been reforming and improving the Navy, working it up. He was a very capable officer. And here's where we get into the real big difference. Because whilst Grimani is the captain of the sea and is technically the most senior officer, he has to deal with the constant politics behind him and politics with him. Reis is in command. He's in command, and there is behind him, and this is the important thing, there is the Captain Pasha, the Capitaneres, the captain, the senior naval officer of the Ottoman Navy, going, he's in charge. He's in charge. Capitaneres is in charge. The captain's race is in charge. I am the senior admiral. I'm not here at this battle. I will funnel resources through. I will organize things, but I'm not there myself, and that's fine. That's perfectly fine, and it's a good battle for them. He was basically raised as a useful commander. And a skilled officer. Which brings us to the context of the battle. All that manoeuvring, and it's the Battle of Bull Run, isn't it? It is the Battle of Bull Run again. It's takes place actually in this little area, the Lepanto area, broadly speaking, of the Ionian Sea, which, by the way, the Ionian Sea is beautiful in that the yellow lines might be the borders, the orange lines might be the borders, the red lines might be the borders, all three might be the borders, depending on who you're talking to. It's beautiful, but pretty much they are fighting over this area. And this area matters, this sort of space here, because Constantinople, as it's officially called at the time, I know people start calling it Istanbul from 1453 onwards, but it doesn't officially change its name to Istanbul till 1930. So, not Istanbul yet. It's Constantinople still. And Venice is that way. Venice is that. And this is halfway between. And if you want to also deal with Sicily, Italy, the other trading positions of powers, you want to control this area because it's a good place to base your fleet from, to organize from. So of course you're going to be pushing that. But it's the same if you're Venice and wanting to push out. If you want to control this area so you have access into the deeper waters of the Mediterranean out to trade with the world, you want to control it. It's a natural confluence and a natural point for engagement. It truly is. Which takes us to the battle. Now, before we get into this battle too much, I have to say, checking some of my Ottoman sources, some of my Italian sources, and the various sources I've got running around us, one other thing comes up, and I forgot to mention this in the ship discussion. There are ships referred to occasionally in sources as galleons at the battle, or by the Ottoman sources. Galleons don't come into service that aren't constructed in terms of what we consider as a galleon, by definition a galleon, until the 16th century. This is the end of the 15th. They are caravels. They are caravel-built carracks. They are not galleons. They are big, yes, but they are not galleons. There's also sometimes a dispute over who's in command of the battle, because the Italian sources and most English-speaking sources tend to use the officers who actually are there on site in charge of the battle as being in charge of battle. Some of the Ottoman sources, because of the way they work, attribute it to the officer who is acting as the head admiral at the time. He doesn't seem to be there for most of the fighting or actually in charge. He seems to have had Camorres leading the fight, and he's organising everything else going on. Because he's running a... You have to remember, this is a big battle for the Venetians, but it's one part of quite a large plan for the Ottomans. This is also where those figures of those numbers of ships, they have hundreds of ships at this fight, and you go, do they really? No, that's what they have in the fleet. What is Goth doing what? Where are all the troops? Where are all the Janissaries doing? All these things add up. So I have to add that in before we get into the Battle of Zonchio. I forgot to put it in the ship section. Because it matters, and because these things can get misunderstood and misinterpreted. But pretty much, I think what it comes from is that the Ottomans tend to refer to the ships as being very big. And because they are very big, some people then translated have been looking at it and going, galleon. And the trouble is, and this is going to sound terrible, but it's not a critique of them, it's just the way of life. If you're a historian translating this topic and you are not a naval historian, you will probably have heard of galleon. It's about the right time period, and will presume big three-masted sailing ship must be galleon. And I can perfectly understand that. But when you're a naval historian looking back at the sources and you're going, looking at the description going, no, that's not a galleon. The woodworking, the shaping of the hull hasn't reached the point at which in anywhere they're building galleons. At this point, it hasn't reached that point anywhere. They're building very fine ships, but they're not building galleons yet. No one is. And you look at the designs and look at the proportions and go, yeah. That's a Caraval-built carrack. It's the largest version of the carrack. But it is not a galleon. And again, where are they at this fight? Because, as I said, one of the fun things is the Italian sources give a very detailed breakdown of the fleet strength. The Ottoman sources give a much less detailed breakdown of the forces. They basically go, we have this many galleys and we have this many large sailing ships. And I'd say they're not exactly wrong, but the thing is, the Ottomans are dealing with the ships as an asset for which they're conducting littoral warfare. The Venetians are dealing with something where the ships are the purpose of the warfare. They're conducting naval warfare. So my instinct is normally to trust the Venetian sources on the types of ships that are placed, because for the Ottomans it's ancillary. They're there to move the army and secure the movement of the forces. For the Venetians, the ships being there are the critical thing. And even the Venetian sources, I look and go, some of the translations, they're not quite correct. So you have to be careful with basically all these things. Now, I would say also there is a interesting discussion which comes out of the battle as to who was technically superior to who. I would argue that both are very strong navies. There are some sources which will claim the Venetians were technically superior, and there are the Ottomans are technically superior. I would suggest that the Ottomans are very well invested in, as are the Venetians. Both sides are pretty darn good. I mean, it's pretty much a peer fight, other than numbers, where the Ottomans certainly have an overwhelming advantage. There's also a lot of interplay between the two forces. There's been a lot of looking at each other, studying each other, fighting each other 20 years previously. This means they're often using vessels which are not too dissimilar, because they've learnt from each other. With that being said, bearing in mind Grimani's reluctance to engage prior to this, he basically takes his position, his flagship in the centre. He lines up with the other large galleys. Left wing is under Simone Guerra, consists of roughly 17 galletori. Right wing has roughly 14 galletori. And he has another 11 galletori in reserve, roughly. But as they're forming up, and as they're getting into position, and instructions are being given, Andrea Loren turns up with Simone Greco, and they bring them with them 11 more Grippi, and some caravals, some caravel-built carracks. And those are the larger vessels we tend to talk about. Now, they give him an advantage. They really do. They give him a strength. And so he starts trying to make use of these assets. But there's a problem. There is honestly a massive problem. And this is the 12th of August. That's the first round of the battle. Venetians blow their trumpets, hoist their flags, and they are prepared for battle. But none of their officers move. And once those the Lordine and Greco have arrived at their ships, they start organising themselves again. And the battle basically gets worse. on the 20th, by the time it gets to the 20th, Grimani's ordering the crews to kill any captains who refuse to fight. Despite this, and 4 French galleys arriving to reinforce them, just 2 of the galleys actually go and attack the Ottomans, but both survive and return unharmed. So, in the nicest way, whilst it's an actually pitiful effort, when then I read some reports going, the great victory was due to the excellence of Ottoman gunnery, I sit there and go, well, 2 ships went forward, and yeah, no one came back, and they came back. The captains kept ignoring Grimani's orders to attack the Ottomans. And this is the problem. There is much discussion which comes about afterwards, and different powers seeking glory. What we do know is that the Venetian officers proved far less reliable than the Ottoman ones. If there is a decisive advantage the Ottomans have in this battle over the Venetians, it's in the willingness of their officers to engage with their ships. There are actually specific rules the Venetians had that you weren't allowed to loot a ship till the battle was over. In the final battle of the 25th of August, some actually Ottoman vessels were captured. But they fell to looting the ships, and the Ottomans managed to recapture the vessels. It was such a disgusting performance, the French actually abandoned the Venetians. They went to Rhodes instead. Thought they could do more useful help there. And it's about this point as well that Andrea Lorin, remember, who'd shown up with the Caravel-built carracks. Well, he and another Caravel-built carrack, managed to board one of the Ottoman flagships. Burak Reis's flagship. Not Kemal Reis, Burak Reis's flagship. The Ottomans are unable to disengage, and they set her aflame to stop them taking it. These 3 ships are stuck together, and they not only burn, they eventually go boom. And Venetian morale, which was already in the pits, goes with it. After the battle, it gets interesting. After the battle, it gets really interesting, because, yeah, French gone, everyone gone. They've gone boom. And when they get home, Grimani's arrested. Grimani is arrested. After it comes out exactly... there's an interesting thing. The Ottomans consider it, he managed to talk himself out of it, and then turns back it's due to the passion and quality of his defense. But mostly it's due to the Venetians getting a source as exactly how many of their ships luffed their sails, how many of their ships didn't assist, what exactly happened, what exactly the performance of the captains were, and the absolute carnage of infighting that was the war councils. Running operations by war council is never a good idea. It really isn't. So what's the consequences then for the first cannon battle? Because that's what this really is. It's the first battle where both sides are blasting each other with cannon. Well, realistically, it's a sign of things to come, but the trouble is no one's really sure what to do with it. You see, you can stand off with cannon and blast away merrily with each other, but the cannon you're using at this point are, frankly, pathetic. They're not going to sink a ship. This is one of them. This is what they look like. You could do some damage, and maybe if you did enough in aggregate, you might eventually sink a ship, but it's very unlikely. Very, very unlikely. But the point is, it's an artillery duel, and it's trying to break each other's formation. And if the Venetians had managed to break into the Ottoman formation, they could have done some damage with it, especially with their caravel-built carracks there. But they'd have come up against the Ottoman ones. Although we're not quite sure where their ones are. There are probably some involved in the battle, but we're not sure where. The old side, if we're looking at this particular image, you have an idea where some of their larger vessels might be. This one, of course, does look like, to me, an oared carrack. And that does describe some of the larger ships which the Ottomans are building at this point. Does definitely describe them. It's more carrack than galleon. You can tell by the shaping of the bow, you can tell by the angle of the hull. But again, it's based off an artistic interpretation, so you can't be 100%. But yeah, that is far more caravel-built carrack than galleon, with added oars. And this was what they were doing. This is what they had. So again, it's probably a great. The cannon has arrived. What has it really done? And there's a reason that realistically, you see it's after the Battle of Panto in 1571. 72 years later, the people are going around, cannon are here at sea! The future is cannon, everything's going to be cannon, all is going to be cannon! Instead they go, it's the new wonder weapon! And you're going, but that's 72 years after it entered service. You see, that's the fun piece of history. It's that people sometimes forget that all these things have happened before. Wonder weapons which are these new weapons which are going to revolutionize warfare, going to change everything. They come around on a regular basis. But usually they've been in service for a lot longer than you think about, or you will really realize, before they declared the wonder weapon. And often, the thing that they are marketed as going to be doing, is going to be revolutionizing, is not what they end up revolutionizing. Here's an interesting thing. The main battle tank. It's a lovely system. The tanks were revolutionary. They were going to replace cavalry, weren't they? But they didn't. In fact, cavalry were probably replaced more by lorries than by tanks. Heavy cavalry, the assets which were supposed to use to be breaking through an enemy line, well, they'd ceased to be breaking through a line since you'd started inventing the bayonet. It had made it very difficult. So, to be honest, the tanks take on that role and provide armoured fire positions that can advance with forces and fire to support and be used as traditional heavy cavalry of breaking through the lines. But realistically, the cavalry role, especially the dragoons and the fast-moving infantry, which had become to dominate the cavalry role in the run-up to the previous 60 years up to World War I, that role is taken over by motorized infantry. Rapidly deployable, rapidly able to set up in a position and secure it. It's lorries, not tanks, which get rid of cavalry. And they do it by doing the same job more efficiently. That's it. They do it by doing the same tactical mission set more efficiently. It's the same with the introduction of cannon. The traditional method of sinking a ship, especially the Mediterranean, was ramming it, because you make a big hole that lets water in. Cannon take on the role of making big holes that let water in. These cannon aren't going to do that. They might start a fire if you're lucky, but probably not. They might cause splinters. They might cause minor damage. They're not going to really start a big enough fire, big enough hole that's going to let enough water in to sink anything which is large enough to be worth sinking with them. It's worth the cost of them. But you have them, because they can cause tremendous damage to things like the oars and the other systems on a ship which stop its maneuverability and allow you to dominate it and maybe capture it. But as time goes on, they get bigger, they get more powerful, they get more accurate. And then they can start making holes in ships and they can start sinking them. And that's when people start working out, well, what's the counter to that? Well, build a heavier built ship. Have more cannon. Have thicker hulls. It's always a brain race. It's always a thought race. And it's never a simple X trumps Y, and always will do. That being said, I'd like you to think about other first battles in history. Where are the first battles in history where cannon or gunpowder weapons are used, versus where are the first battles in history where they're remembered for being used? As in, they dominate the battle. Rather than just they're there, they're being used. We're not sure, really. We're not sure. Okay. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. What we've got coming up next week. Oh, not announced next week yet. It's going to be fun when that premiere is advertised. Take care, everyone. Thank you for watching, and hope you enjoyed. And if you like the video, please do consider like, sharing, and subscribing. It really does help the channel grow. And remember, for every channel you like, if you want to beat the YouTube algorithm, you make sure that bell is filled in. If that bell next to subscribe is filled in, you will see their videos when they come out. If it's not, it'll be the YouTube algorithm deciding which of their videos you see in your feed.